Marcus had made the cake himself. That was the part nobody would have expected. Not his co-workers. Not the handful of friends he'd invited, and then quietly disinvited when his mother said she was coming. He'd made it himself, because she wasn't the kind of woman who baked cakes, and someone had to, and because turning 30 felt like the kind of thing that deserved a cake, even when the occasion was most just the two of them at a kitchen table, in a house that had always felt a little too quiet. He'd set the table with the good plates. He'd even ironed a shirt. She arrived at 4:30, and he knew immediately that the year had not been kind to her. She moved through the front door carefully, like a woman mapping the distance between herself and the furniture. And when she set her bag down on the entry table, she set it down slowly, the way you set something down when you're not sure your arms will answer when you go to lift it again. She was 51. She looked older in places where a year ago she had looked merely tired. "Happy birthday, Marcus," she said. "Mom." He stepped back to let her in. "How was the drive?" "Fine." She looked at the table. "You made a cake. Someone had to." That was the whole welcome. That was the whole 400 miles she'd driven. And the whole 3 years since the last visit. And the whole 30 years between them, compressed into 12 words. He went back to the kitchen. She followed. They sat down to dinner the way two people sit down to dinner when they have run out of things to say, but have not yet admitted it to themselves. The medals were in the closet. They had always been in the closet, in a flat olive drab box that had come home from her last posting, and had never been opened in his presence. He knew what was inside it, approximately. Ribbons, badges, the particular hardware of a career he had been on the outside of since the day she enlisted, 6 months after he was born. He had held the box once, when he was maybe 12, and had felt how heavy it was, and had put it back on the shelf and closed the closet door. He had not touched it since. She ate carefully, and he watched her do it, and for a long time neither of them said anything that meant anything. He asked about the drive again. She asked about his job. He told her about the job. She said it sounded good. He said it was fine. And then, because he was 30 years old, and she was thinner than she'd been last year, and he had been carrying something since before he could name it, he said it. He didn't say it mean. That was the thing he would remember afterward for a long time. He said it the way you say the thing you've said 10,000 times inside your own head. Flat, almost tired. "I went looking for the box again last week," he said. "Couldn't remember what was in it." He shook his head. "A lot of hardware for a job you loved more than anything." He picked up his fork. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't read. Not hurt, exactly. Something more complicated, like a woman measuring a distance. Then she looked back at her plate. "Yes," she said. "The knock came at 5:50. Marcus heard it and thought, nobody he knew. He went to the door and opened it to a man in his mid-60s, built solid and square, with a gray crew cut and a face that had been weathered past weathered. He was wearing a plain dark jacket and holding a manila folder with both hands, the way you hold something you've driven a long way to deliver. Behind him on the porch steps, partially visible through the screen door, was another man, younger, 40s, standing with his hands folded in front of him. "Marcus Vane," the older man said. "Yeah, my name is Darnell Webb. I was your mother's commanding officer, Firebase Cade, 2001. I apologize for not calling ahead." He paused. "I'd like to come in if you'll let me." Marcus looked past him at the man on the steps, and then past that man toward the street, where the light had started to go gray with evening rain. He could see shapes at the edge of the yard. He couldn't count them yet. "What is this?" Marcus said. "Something I should have come a long time ago to say." Webb looked at the folder. "If you'll let me." Marcus stepped back from the door. His mother was still at the table. She looked up when Webb walked in, and something passed between them. Not surprise on her end, not entirely, more like recognition, and something quieter underneath it, the way you look at a person who has seen the same thing you have seen, and neither of you has ever spoken about it to anybody else. "Colonel," she said, "Elena." He pulled out the chair across from her and didn't sit in it, just rested one hand on the back of it, still holding the folder. "Your boy should hear this." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I suppose he should." Marcus stood at the edge of the kitchen with his arms crossed, watching this, not sure if he was angry or afraid or something in between. He was 30 years old. He had been civil for 6 hours. He said, "Hear what exactly?" Webb set the folder on the table and opened it. The document inside was several pages, typed and stamped with a seal at the top that Marcus recognized as the Department of the Army. Webb didn't hand it to him. He read it aloud, standing at the table, in the voice of a man who has read citations before but had not yet read this. One for anyone who needed to hear it the way Marcus needed to hear it. He read the date, September 14, 2001, Firebase Cade, Eastern Sector. An enemy indirect fire attack, beginning at 0317 hours, that destroyed the primary radio position and the secondary relay within 4 minutes, leaving the forward element, 22 soldiers, cut off with no communication to the rear support line and no way to call for the fire support. That would be the difference between extraction and not, he read. That Sergeant First Class Elena Vane, forward intelligence observer, moved on her own initiative from the covered position she'd been ordered to hold across 40 meters of open ground under direct small arms contact to reach a tertiary radio set that had been damaged but not destroyed. He read that she had operated that radio for 1 hour and 19 minutes, transmitting fire coordinates, adjusting the mission, correcting twice when the first rounds fell wide, calmly, methodically, correctly, while sustaining a fragment wound to her left shoulder that she did not report until the mission was complete. He read that all 22 soldiers of the forward element were recovered alive. He read her call sign. Clearwater, he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Marcus had not moved. He was standing at the edge of the room with his arms still crossed, but the posture meant something different now. It was not closed anymore. It was something you do when you're trying to hold yourself together and don't know yet whether it's going to work. He looked at his mother. She was looking at the table. Her left hand was resting on the tablecloth, and he could see, because he'd never had reason to look before, that the shoulder on that side sat slightly lower than the other one. He had always thought it was just the way she stood. He saw now that it was not. 22, Marcus said. Yes, Webb said. She never said anything. Webb closed the folder carefully. No, she wouldn't. He looked at Elena. I tried to get her to talk to people about it. She was fairly clear on the subject. His mother said nothing. She kept looking at the table, in the way of a woman who has been asked to carry a thing quietly. For so long that quiet has become her only mode, Marcus uncrossed his arms. He walked to the window above the kitchen sink and looked out at the backyard, which was dim now, and he could see the reflection of the kitchen light in the glass, and his own face in it, and behind his face the reflected table where his mother was sitting. And he stood there for a moment, just looking at all of it. Then he walked to the front of the house and opened the door. They were standing in the yard. 22 men. Some of them older, some of them in their late 30s or 40s, some gray at the temples and some not. They were standing in the rain. It had started to come down properly now, steady and cold, and none of them were moving, and none of them were talking, and some of them were holding hats or caps to their chests. One man in the front had his head bowed. Another, at the back of the group near the street, was standing at something close to parade rest, not because anyone had told him to, but because he didn't seem to know what else to do with himself. Webb had made calls 3 weeks earlier, when the prognosis had changed. He had told them the date and the address. They had come. Nobody had asked for directions twice. Marcus stood on the porch in his iron shirt. He looked out at 22 men standing in the rain in his front yard, not moving, waiting for nothing in particular, having driven or flown most of a day to stand in the rain in the dark in front of a house they had never been to, because a woman inside that house had once crossed 40 meters of open ground to bring them home. He put his hand on the doorframe. He had made a cake. He had ironed a shirt. He had said something at dinner that he would carry for a long time. He went back inside. His mother was still at the table. Webb had moved to stand by the window, and he stepped back slightly to give Marcus the room. Marcus pulled out the chair beside his mother, not across from her, beside her, and sat down. He sat there for a moment without saying anything. Then he reached across and put his hand over hers. Her hand was thin. The shoulder still sat low. 22, he said again, quietly this time. Not a question. She looked up at him. Her eyes were steady, the way they had always been, the way that had frustrated him at 12, and at 16, and at 23, and at 27, the steadiness that he had always read as distance. He could see now that it was not distance. It was just what you look like when you've made a decision once, a long time ago, to carry something without setting it down. I didn't tell you because I didn't want it to be the reason, she said. For anything. I didn't want you to forgive me because of a file. I wanted. She stopped. She looked at their hands. I know what I missed. I've always known. Marcus didn't say anything. Outside, the rain came down steadily. After a while, he got up and went to the closet. He came back with the olive drab box and set it on the table between them. And he opened it. The ribbons were there, and the badges, and in a flat leather case at the bottom, the cross. The Distinguished Service Cross, bronze and worn, on its ribbon of blue and red, the kind of thing that doesn't get presented without a room full of people, and the sound of orders being read aloud, unless the recipient has specifically requested that it be mailed. She had specifically requested that it be mailed. He took it out of the case and held it in his palm. It was heavier than he expected. Heavier than anything that size had a right to be. He looked at it for a long time. Webb was still standing by the window. He wasn't watching them. He was looking outside at the yard, at the men in the rain, and his face held the particular expression of a man who has been carrying a debt for 20 years, and has just now figured out where to put it down. They're going to stand there all night if you don't go out, Marcus said. Webb looked at him. They will, Webb agreed. Marcus set the medal back in its case. He picked up the whole box, the ribbons and the badges and the cross, and he carried it to the front door and set it on the entry table. Not in the closet, on the table, where it could be seen. And then he opened the door and went out onto the porch, and stood there in the cold air, with the rain coming down, and looked out at 22 men standing in his front yard. He didn't know what to say. He didn't have to say anything. The man in the front, the one who had his head bowed, lifted his head and looked at Marcus for a moment. Then he looked past Marcus, through the screen door, to where Elena Vane was visible, at the kitchen table in the light. He held that look for 3 seconds. Then he brought his hand up. Not a wave, not a greeting, a salute, slow and deliberate, the way you render it to someone who earned it at a price nobody could repay, and held it there in the rain. And one by one, in no particular order, with no one giving the command, the other 21 did the same. Marcus stood on the porch of the house he'd grown up in, the house that had always been too quiet, and watched 22 men render honors in the rain to a woman who had never once asked for them. He reached back through the screen door and found his mother's hand. She was standing just inside. She had followed him to the door without him hearing her, the way she had always moved, quietly, and with purpose, and without making a production of it. He held her hand. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. They stood there together, the two of them, while the rain fell, and the men held their salutes, and 30 years of quiet slowly became something else. Something that didn't need a name. Something that was enough.